Stand steady, the 4-star said without raising his voice. When the call comes, you answer clean. No commentary, no improvisation. The wind cut across the cemetery in disciplined lines, snapping the flags against white marble. I could smell cut grass and the faint wax from my dress shoes. My father's casket was still open behind me, the brass fixtures cold and structured, precise. Somewhere beyond the trees, reporters were whispering about the U.S. Iran war like it had simply paused. The general held my father's name tag between 2 fingers. Then he placed a sealed envelope in my palm. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments, and I will give you a heart. My father believed in structure. That was the word he used instead of love. Structure keeps things steady. Structure keeps things clean. He said it when I was 8 and stood too close to the television while news anchors talked about Tehran like it was a weather system drifting in from the coast. He said it when I was 16 and forgot to iron the crease into my JROTC trousers. And he said it the last time I saw him alive, standing in the kitchen at 0500, coffee measured to the gram, boots aligned beneath the bench, a man who had reduced his life to disciplined angles and labeled shelves. What he did not believe in was waste, and that included emotion. My mother called him transactional. She would say it under her breath while drying a single plate at a time, as if each dish had to earn its place in the cabinet. He never argued. He would simply open his small leather notebook, make a record of the grocery total, and close it with a click that sounded final. When I came home from my first deployment with a commendation, he did not hug me. He inspected the ribbon bar for alignment, adjusted it by 2 millimeters, and said, "Presentation is part of the record." That was humiliation number 1. Quiet and precise, delivered in front of my cousin who had come to watch me walk in wearing the uniform. I stood there, chest still carrying desert dust in the seams, and let him square me like furniture. The second humiliation came at my sister's engagement dinner when he handed me a thin envelope across the table and said, "Reimbursement," because I had paid for his medication the previous month. He had calculated the exact amount with interest, as if I were a creditor, not his son. Everyone laughed awkwardly. I kept the envelope sealed and slid it into my pocket, steady, disciplined, clean. That was the rhythm of our house. You did not get affection. You got documentation. The antagonist in our family was not a villain in the loud sense. It was my Uncle Reza, my mother's brother, who moved through rooms like a consultant, always assessing leverage. He had never served, but he knew how to speak in the tone of someone who had read the manuals. At holidays, he would ask my father about pensions and survivor benefits with a casual curiosity that felt rehearsed. "It's all structured now, right?" he would say, carving lamb with surgical precision. Nothing left to chance. My father would nod once and change the subject. After my mother died, Reza began visiting more often, offering to help with paperwork. I watched him lift my father's medals from a cedar box and lay them on the coffee table like coins in a transaction. The Bronze Star slid against a coaster ring and left a faint scratch on the wood. He picked up the Purple Heart by its ribbon and let it dangle, inspecting it as if it were a commodity. "These must be worth something," he said, turning it over to read the engraving. I stepped forward and took it from him, thumb brushing the cold metal, feeling the ridge where my father's name had been stamped in disciplined letters. "They're not inventory," I said. Reza smiled in that professional way that never reached his eyes. "Everything is inventory if it has a beneficiary." The midpoint confrontation came 2 weeks before my father died. We were in the garage where he kept his tools in labeled drawers, sockets arranged by diameter, wrenches hung in ascending order. Reza leaned against the workbench and slid a folder toward me. The paper was heavy, clean, embossed with the logo of a law firm downtown. "Sign this acknowledgement," he said. "It simplifies the estate. You'll get your portion faster." I did not sit. I read the header, the structured language that reduced decades of service to line items and percentages. "Why does it remove my executor status?" I asked. Reza's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. "It's procedural. Less friction. You're busy." I looked at my father, who was wiping down a torque wrench with a cloth, steady as always. He did not look up. "Dad." I said. He placed the wrench back in its drawer, closed it, and finally met my eyes. Read everything twice, he said. Never sign what you don't understand. Reza exhaled sharply. This isn't a battlefield. My father's voice stayed calm. It's worse. It's paperwork. That night I stayed late and reorganized the metal box myself, aligning each ribbon bar, cleaning the glass case with ammonia until it smelled sharp and industrial. I noticed something then, a small detail that did not fit the structure I thought I knew. Beneath the metals was a thin layer of foam that lifted out cleanly, revealing a secondary compartment I had never seen. Inside was a passport I did not recognize. It was navy blue, thicker than a standard issue, and when I opened it, the stamps were not tourist entries. They were coded clearances, embassy seals from places that never made the news ticker. The dates overlapped with years he claimed to be stateside. Tucked beside it was a laminated card with a barcode and a designation I had only seen in briefings, not in my own unit but referenced in whispers. The realization was not dramatic. It was structured. My father's life had layers, disciplined compartments beneath visible metals. Reza's footsteps echoed in the hallway, and I slid the foam back into place, closing the cedar lid with a soft click. If you're watching this from somewhere steady, somewhere far from Arlington or Tehran, tell me where you're standing right now, because geography has a way of shaping loyalty. I stood there in that garage, oil and sawdust in the air, and understood that the man I thought was merely rigid had been operating inside a larger system. The next morning, before the sun rose clean over the rooftops, I checked the garage again. The cedar box was slightly misaligned, not by much, but enough for someone trained to notice. The foam layer had been replaced imperfectly. Reza had been inside, and when I lifted the lid, the secondary compartment was empty except for a single indentation where the passport had rested, a rectangular absence that felt louder than any argument. That was when I understood that whatever the 4-star had meant at the funeral, whatever the sealed envelope contained, my father's life was not finished business. It was an active file, and someone in my own family was already trying to close it clean before I could read the record. I did not confront Reza about the missing passport because confrontation without documentation is noise, and my father raised me to keep things steady and clean. So instead, I went to the first institution listed inside the sealed envelope the 4-star had pressed into my palm at the cemetery, a Federal Credit Union 3 blocks from the old base gate, the kind of building that smells faintly of carpet cleaner and printer toner, where flags are framed in the lobby and the security guard stands. With the posture of someone who once wore a uniform properly, and I signed in at the front desk using my full legal name, printed in block letters, disciplined, no flourish, while the receptionist glanced at my ID and then at the small gold star embossed on the envelope I placed on the counter. Her eyes pausing half a second too long before she picked up the phone and said, "He's here," as if the building had been expecting me, which told me immediately that my father's life had been operating on a structured layer above what I understood. And when the branch manager came out, she did not shake my hand first. She asked for the code phrase printed on the inner flap of the envelope, a line of numbers and a single word that looked random until I recognized the pattern, a grid reference format disguised as an account key. And I recited it calmly, steady voice, because I had learned in briefing rooms that hesitation is a signal. And she nodded once and led me through a glass door into a smaller office where the blinds were half drawn and the air conditioning hummed with a disciplined rhythm. And she placed a thin tablet in front of me and said, "Your father activated a beneficiary layer under Title 38 Supplemental Asset Protection. It requires biometric confirmation." And I pressed my thumb against the screen exactly as instructed, holding it there until the green ring completed its circle, clean and precise. And the first file opened, revealing not a simple bank balance, but a structured cascade of accounts tied to coded projects, each with alphanumeric labels that matched the embassy stamps I had glimpsed before they disappeared, and the manager did not comment on the amounts. She only said, "These accounts are locked pending executor verification. There has been an inquiry filed to freeze them." And I did not ask who filed it because I already knew. And she slid across the desk a printed notice of contested authority, bearing the letterhead of a law firm downtown, Reza's firm, and the timestamp was from 40 minutes after my father's death certificate had been issued. which meant he had been prepared, and I felt the old heat rise in my chest, but I kept my posture steady because emotion is what people use when they do not have a record, and I asked instead, what documentation is required to override the freeze? And she replied, original executor confirmation and proof of operational designation, which sounded vague until she tapped the screen and highlighted a field labeled clearance continuity clause. And I understood then that my father had embedded a protocol that extended beyond family law, something that required not just a signature, but a verification of service tier. And that was when the gatekeeper leaned back slightly and studied my uniform collar pins, noticing the insignia that most civilians miss, and she said quietly, you were briefed for this possibility, weren't you? And I did not answer directly, I simply requested access to the notary log for the last amendment to the account structure, because my father always amended documents in person, never by proxy, and the manager hesitated, citing privacy policy. And that was when I used the veteran-learned skill that shifts conversations without raising volume. I referenced the specific subsection of the Patriot Act Compliance Manual that grants executors access when a freeze is contested under suspicious timing, and I cited the paragraph number from memory. Because I had once sat through a financial readiness seminar that bored everyone else in my unit, and the manager's expression changed from polite to alert, and she stood up and retrieved a binder from a locked cabinet, flipping to a page marked with a red tab. And there it was, my father's signature dated 3 months before his death, steady and angular, next to a note that read, in the event of external pressure, default to structured review, which meant he anticipated someone moving quickly against his estate. And the notary stamp bore a serial number that I recognized from base operations, meaning the amendment had been witnessed by someone with clearance, not a random clerk, and that detail shifted the entire situation from family dispute to potential interference with a protected asset layer. And as I absorbed this, my phone vibrated with a message from my cousin Farid saying, we need to talk about Dad's finances, the casual phrasing almost rehearsed, and I replied, with a single word, scheduled, because I would not meet on their timeline, and the manager then produced a second document I had not requested, a beneficiary escalation notice that doubled the stakes by listing not just monetary assets, but a restricted trust tied to ongoing contractual obligations with the Department of Defense. And I felt the room narrow slightly, not from fear, but from clarity, because this was no longer about inheritance. It was about continuity of an operational record. And the manager said, if the freeze stands for more than 72 hours, the trust reverts to federal review, which meant that Ray's legal maneuver could trigger an audit that would expose layers of my father's work that were likely still sensitive. And I leaned forward and asked for the procedural path to prevent that reversion. And she outlined a sequence that required an in-person confirmation at the VA regional office, submission of the executor oath, and verification by a ranking officer listed in the sealed envelope. And that was when I understood why the 4-star had told me to stand steady and answer clean when the call came. Because this was a chain, and every link had to be handled without improvisation. And as I stood to leave the office, I noticed through the glass partition that Reza himself had entered the lobby, speaking with the receptionist in that low consultant tone, holding a leather portfolio under his arm, and he glanced up and saw me behind the glass. And for a moment, his professional mask flickered, just slightly, as if he had not expected me to move this quickly, and I adjusted my jacket, squared my shoulders, and walked out to meet him in the open space between teller windows and flag display, the institutional lighting casting everything in flat clarity, and he smiled and said, I was just here to simplify things, and I replied, you're 40 minutes too late. And the security guard's eyes shifted between us, sensing tension, but hearing no raised voices, and Reza lowered his voice and said, you don't understand the scale of what he was involved in. And I answered, that's why I'm reading the record. And he tried one last angle. If this goes federal, it gets messy for everyone. And I held his gaze steady and said, it was federal before you filed the freeze. And that was when he realized the structure he thought he could manipulate had layers he had not mapped. And he stepped back, adjusting his cufflinks, recalibrating. And I walked past him toward the exit without turning around, because the only direction that mattered was forward into the next institution, the VA office where the executor oath would be logged into a permanent database. And as the automatic doors slid open and the air outside hit my face, I understood that the document doubling the stakes was not the money. It was the clause stating that in the event of executor incapacitation, the trust would transfer to a designated successor whose name was redacted pending confirmation, and I did not know yet who that successor was, but I knew one thing with disciplined certainty. My father had structured this so that if I failed to move cleanly and steadily through each gate, someone else would step into the role. And that possibility was the first real threat I felt, not from Reza, but from the system itself, which does not wait for hesitation. And as I checked the time on my watch and calculated the hours remaining before the 72-hour window closed, my phone vibrated again with an unknown number, and when I answered, a calm voice said, "This is the office of the Undersecretary. We need to confirm your intent regarding your father's operational file." And the line went quiet, waiting for my response, clean, disciplined on the record. "I intend to assume full executor authority and maintain operational continuity," I said into the phone without stepping away from the curb. Traffic moving past in steady lanes, my reflection faint in the glass of the VA building across the street, and the voice on the other end paused just long enough to confirm the call was being recorded before replying. "Your statement is now part of the preliminary record." And that word record settled into place like a bolt locking into a receiver. Because from that moment forward, every breath, every signature, every hesitation would exist inside a system that does not forget. And I crossed the street at a measured pace, feeling the weight of my father's dog tags in my pocket, the metal cool and disciplined against my palm. And when I entered the VA regional office, the smell of industrial floor wax and old paper met me again. A familiar institutional scent that always reminded me that structures outlive the people who move through them. And I took a number from the dispenser, even though I already had an appointment logged under my name, because procedure matters, and I sat in a molded plastic chair and watched as an elderly veteran argued quietly with a clerk about a missing form 21-534 easy. His voice thin, but steady, and I memorized the layout of the counters, the cameras mounted in the ceiling corners, the way the clerks kept their stamps aligned parallel to the desk edges, and when my number appeared on the screen, I approached window for where a woman with steel gray hair and a posture that suggested prior service looked up and said, "Executor verification." Not a question, but an acknowledgement, and I handed her the sealed envelope, the bank's contested authority notice, and the notary log copy in a clean stack, edges squared, and she flipped through each page without commentary, her pen tapping once against the counter before she said, "There's already a petition filed in probate court challenging your standing." And she turned the monitor slightly so I could see the docket number. Reza's firm listed as petitioner, filed under emergency review. And I felt the escalation tighten, but I did not react visibly. I simply asked, "Has the challenge been entered into the federal beneficiary layer?" And she nodded once, temporarily flagged. And then she slid a thin tablet toward me and said, "You'll need to swear the executor oath under penalty of perjury and confirm knowledge of potential classified implications." And the phrasing alone shifted the room's temperature because this was no longer estate management, it was federal continuity. And I placed my right hand flat on the counter instead of raising it because the camera mounted above us would capture the biometric confirmation through the tablet sensor. And I read the oath line by line, not skipping a word, steady cadence, disciplined breathing. And when I reached the clause about safeguarding restricted operational metadata, I understood that my father's accounts were likely tied to something still active, something beyond simple retirement assets, and I signed my name in block letters, pressing firmly enough that the stylus left a faint imprint on the protective film, and the clerk then reached beneath the counter and retrieved a metal stamp, heavy and rectangular, the kind that leaves a clean embossed seal. And she aligned it carefully over the page before bringing it down with a controlled strike, the sound sharp and final. And she said, "Your oath is logged at 1,423 hours. And in that moment, the structure shifted in my favor. Not because of emotion, but because the record now reflected my intent. And as she processed the digital upload, I noticed through the glass doors that Reza had entered the lobby again, this time accompanied by a junior associate carrying a slim briefcase. Their movements precise but slightly rushed, and he caught my eye through the reflection and offered a small nod that felt less confident than before, and the clerk leaned closer and said quietly, he filed a motion to suspend federal verification pending probate review. "It won't hold if your documentation is complete." And I replied, "It is, because I had already cross-checked every page against the notary serial numbers and clearance clause language, and if you believe in honoring the record rather than rumors, stay with this and make sure your own voice is documented when it matters, because silence never enters the archive." And the clerk's monitor flashed a notification, a secure message from the office of the undersecretary requesting in-person confirmation within 24 hours, and she printed the notice on thick paper that carried a faint watermark visible only when tilted toward the light, and she handed it to me and said, "Once this is signed by a ranking witness, the probate challenge loses leverage." And that was when Reza approached the counter, keeping his voice low but firm. "There are broader implications here," he said, addressing the clerk as if she were a junior analyst. "My client is concerned about exposure," and she did not look at him. She simply said, "This is a federal layer, sir. Your petition is noted but not controlling." And I watched the small muscle in his jaw tighten, a crack in the professional facade he had worn so carefully, and he turned to me and said, "You don't know what you're stepping into." And I answered evenly, "Neither do you," and the junior associate shifted his weight, eyes flicking toward the cameras, calculating risk, and Reza tried one more angle. "If this triggers a review of certain overseas engagements, it could complicate things for everyone." And I held his gaze and replied, "Then it's good the review will be clean." And he exhaled sharply, stepping back, because he understood now that I was not improvising. I was following structure. And as I left the counter with the stamped oath in my hand, the clerk called after me, "Make sure the ranking witness signs in blue ink. Black won't pass audit." A small detail that could invalidate everything if missed, and I nodded once, disciplined, and walked toward the exit where the afternoon light cut across the lobby floor in clean lines. And my phone vibrated again with a notification from the federal docket system confirming that my executor oath had been cross-referenced with the contested probate petition, status updated to active review. And I paused just outside the building and checked the time, calculating the window remaining before the 72-hour reversion clause could activate, and the sky above was clear, almost indifferent, and I felt no surge of triumph, only the steady awareness that the next step would determine whether my father's operational file remained under family stewardship or shifted into federal custody permanently. And as I slid the stamped document into a protective sleeve, I noticed a small handwritten note at the bottom of the undersecretary's notice, a single line in disciplined script that read, "Bring the Pelican case." And I understood then that the empty indentation in the cedar box had not been the only compartment in my father's life, and whatever was inside that military grade case would either secure the record or complicate it beyond recovery. And the hearing scheduled for the following morning at 0900 hours would be the threshold where every document, every stamp, every clean signature would be locked into the permanent archive, and once entered, nothing could be erased. The Pelican case was heavier than it looked, matte black with reinforced corners worn just enough to prove it had traveled, the latches snapping open with a clean mechanical resistance that told me the internal pressure valve had been sealed recently. And I set it on the dining table where my father used to align his bills into perfect stacks, though it's still bearing the faint scratch from the time Reza had dragged the purple heart across it. And I entered the combination I had memorized years ago, not because he told me to, but because I once watched him unlock it in the garage mirror. The numbers reflected backward in the chrome of a torque wrench, and when the lid lifted, the foam interior revealed 3 compartments structured with disciplined symmetry, each cut to exact dimensions, and in the first slot lay a hardened external drive encased in military-grade casing. In the second, a slim binder sealed with tamper-evident tape, and in the third, a stack of notarized affidavits clipped together with a steel fastener that still carried the faint impression of a government seal. And I did not rush. I photographed the contents in their original alignment using my phone's secure app, time-stamping each image, because chain of custody is not assumed. It is documented, and only then did I remove the binder, slicing the tamper tape carefully along the edge so the serial number remained intact. And inside were travel records printed from a defense contractor's internal system, each page listing flight manifests, embassy clearances, and coded project names that matched the alphanumeric labels I had seen in the credit union accounts. And my father's name appeared in columns marked liaison, oversight, and continuity officer, roles that explained the coded passport, but reframed his quiet retirement as a structured extension rather than an end. And I flipped to the affidavits where 3 signatures stood out. One belonging to a retired colonel, another to a civilian analyst, whose name I recognized from a briefing slide years ago, and the third to the 4-star general who had spoken to me at the funeral, each affidavit affirming that my father had been tasked with safeguarding a continuity trust designed to fund ongoing operations if political shifts disrupted official channels. And I felt the weight of the system settle into place. Not dramatic, but precise, because this was not hidden wealth. It was a responsibility layered beneath family life, and my phone buzzed with a message from Reza requesting an immediate meeting, the phrasing softer now, almost conciliatory, and I replied with a location and time, choosing a public conference room at the courthouse where audio is routinely recorded, because if there would be a final plea, it would enter the archive cleanly. And when I arrived, he was already seated at the long oak table, jacket removed, tie loosened slightly in a way that signaled calculated vulnerability, and he began not with accusation, but with memory. "Your father was proud of you," he said, hands folded, voice steady but strained, and I did not respond emotionally. I placed the Pelican case on the table between us and opened it just enough for him to see the binder's edge, and I said, "This is not about pride." And he exhaled, the first visible crack in his professional posture. "You don't understand the political exposure," he insisted. "If those travel logs surface in open court, it could complicate relationships." And I replied, "They won't surface in open court unless forced. The trust is structured to prevent that." And he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Then let me handle it quietly. Sign over administrative control. I can shield you from scrutiny." And there it was, the final attempt to convert responsibility into transaction. And I ignored the emotional framing entirely, sliding one affidavit toward him, the one bearing the 4-star signature, and said, "The continuity clause activates upon executor assumption, which I have already sworn under oath. Your petition is procedural noise." And he stared at the page, the edges of his composure fraying as he realized the system was not as malleable as he believed. And he tried one last tactic, invoking family loyalty. "Your mother would not want this conflict." And I answered calmly, "My mother valued truth." And then I closed the binder and secured the latch on the case, the click echoing softly in the conference room, and stood. Because the hearing was less than 12 hours away, and every document needed to be digitized through the secure federal portal before 0800 hours. And back at my father's house, I connected the hardened drive to my laptop using an encrypted cable. The screen prompting for multi-factor authentication that required both my biometric confirmation and a code sent to the phone number listed in the undersecretary's notice. And when the code arrived, I entered it without hesitation, steady hands, disciplined breathing, and the file directory opened, revealing folders labeled with dates that corresponded to embassy tensions reported in headlines years ago. And I selected the folder marked continuity funding metadata and initiated the upload to the Federal Archive, watching the progress bar move in incremental segments, 12%, 37%, 64%, each pause testing patience. And I resisted the urge to refresh the page because impatience corrupts clean process. And when the bar reached 100%, the screen displayed upload successful in simple black font against a white background. No fanfare, just confirmation, and immediately a digital receipt populated with a timestamp and tracking number that I saved in 3 locations: local drive, secure cloud, and printed copy, aligning the paper precisely before placing it into the Pelican case alongside the affidavits. And as I prepared the final notarized statement summarizing the chain of custody, I heard my phone vibrate. Again, a message from the office of the Undersecretary confirming receipt of the metadata and scheduling the witness verification at 0900 hours sharp. And beneath the confirmation was a single line that reframed everything. "Your father designated this trust as protective continuity, not personal inheritance." And I sat back in the chair, the hum of the laptop fan steady in the quiet room, and understood fully that what I was defending was not wealth, but a safeguard built to prevent disruption if official channels failed. And that Reza's attempt to seize control had not been simple greed, but perhaps fear of exposure he did not comprehend. And I closed the Pelican case once more, the latches snapping shut with finality, and placed it beside the front door, ready for the morning, knowing that when the stamp struck the record at the hearing there would be no reversal. Only the clean acknowledgement that my father's life had been structured around responsibility and protection, and that I had chosen to honor that structure rather than convert it into a transaction. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, I stood in the quiet hallway of the house he had kept so orderly and realized that the system was about to validate not just an executor, but a lineage of discipline. And once entered into the permanent archive, that validation would stand beyond family argument, beyond rumor, beyond emotion. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, fluorescent lights humming overhead, a digital clock mounted above the judge's bench reading 8:57 in steady red numbers, and I placed the Pelican case on the counsel table with the handle facing outward, disciplined alignment, because presentation becomes part of the record, whether acknowledged or not. And Reza sat across from me in a dark suit that fit perfectly, but hung differently today. The shoulders slightly rounded as if the weight of the previous 72 hours had settled there, and his junior associate arranged a thin stack of papers beside him with careful precision, though I noticed his fingers tapping once against the edge, betraying tension, and when the clerk called the case number, the sound echoed clean against the paneled walls, and we stood simultaneously, the choreography almost military in its structure, and the judge entered without flourish, robe falling into place as she took her seat, and she began not with commentary but with confirmation of filings, reading each docket entry into the record in a tone that was calm and procedural. And when she reached Reza's emergency petition to suspend federal verification, she paused briefly before asking, "Counsel, on what statutory basis do you assert jurisdiction over a federally protected continuity trust?" And Reza rose, voice steady at first, outlining concerns about exposure and potential diplomatic sensitivity, framing his argument as protective rather than acquisitive. But the judge did not respond to tone. She responded to documentation, and she turned to me and said, "Executor, have you completed federal verification?" And I answered, "Yes, Your Honor," placing the stamped VA oath, the digital upload receipt, and the notarized chain of custody statement in a clean stack before the clerk. And the sound of the clerk's stamp striking each page landed with controlled finality, one after another, embossing the paper with the court's seal. And the judge reviewed the affidavits, her eyes moving steadily across the signatures of the colonel, the analyst, and the 4-star, and she asked a single question: "Has the office of the undersecretary acknowledged receipt?" And I slid forward the printed confirmation with the tracking number visible at the top, and she nodded once, noting it for the record, and then she looked at Reza and said, "Your petition presumes discretionary control over assets designated under federal continuity authority. Do you contest the authenticity of these affidavits?" And for the first time, his voice lost a fraction of its professional smoothness. "No, Your Honor, but we question the scope." And she responded evenly, "Scope is defined by designation, not preference." And she read aloud the clause stating that executor assumption under oath activates protective status beyond probate interference. And as she spoke the words, I felt the structure settle permanently, not emotionally, but legally. Because once spoken in open court, they become part of the permanent archive. And Reza attempted one final pivot, requesting a sealed review to assess national security implications. But the judge countered with the undersecretary's acknowledgement already entered into evidence, stating that federal oversight had been notified and had not objected to executor continuity. And the silence that followed was not dramatic. It was procedural, the kind of silence that signals resolution. And then the judge delivered the ruling in concise language, dismissing the emergency petition, affirming my standing as executor, and ordering that any further challenges be accompanied by substantive evidence rather than speculative concern. And the clerk struck the stamp one final time, the sound echoing sharper than before, and I watched Reza's posture shift, shoulders lowering, eyes fixed not on me, but on the stack of dismissed filings in front of him. And there was no outburst, no raised voice, just a quiet recalibration as he realized the transaction he had attempted to structure had failed against documentation he could not undermine. And if you value outcomes built on record rather than rumor, make sure your own actions are documented when it matters, because the system does not reward improvisation. And as the hearing concluded, the judge added a final note directing that the federal continuity trust remain under executor stewardship pending routine oversight review. And with that, the legal kill shot landed not as spectacle, but as confirmation, and we gathered our papers in disciplined silence. And outside the courtroom hallway, the fluorescent lights cast a flat clarity over everything. And Reza approached me without his associate, holding no folder now, hands empty, and he said quietly, "I miscalculated. Not an apology, but an admission," and I replied, "You underestimated the structure." And he nodded once, the professional facade fully dissolved into something closer to fatigue, and he asked, was he really still active? And I answered truthfully, he was responsible. And that word seemed to settle between us, heavier than any financial figure. And he exhaled slowly, eyes drifting toward the courthouse window where morning light filtered in, clean and indifferent. And for a moment I saw not an antagonist, but a man who had mistaken complexity for opportunity. And he said, almost to himself, "I thought I was protecting the family," and I responded, "Protection requires understanding." And then I walked away, the Pelican case study at my side, and as I exited the building, my phone vibrated with a secure message confirming that the dismissal had been logged into the Federal Archive, status updated to executor verified, and I paused at the base of the courthouse steps, feeling neither triumph nor relief, but a disciplined stillness, because victory in this context was not about defeating a person. It was about preserving a record, and yet beneath that steadiness there was one unresolved layer that documentation could not address. A memory of my father standing in the kitchen at dawn, coffee measured precisely, saying nothing about the weight he carried. And I realized that while the system had validated my role, it had not answered every question about the scope of his service. And as I looked at the Pelican case in my hand, I understood that inside its foam compartments might still be details I had not fully interpreted. Layers of continuity that extended beyond what had been uploaded. And the morning air felt clean but unfinished, as if the archive had closed one chapter while quietly hinting at another. And I knew that discipline had secured the present. But curiosity about the past was beginning to surface, steady and persistent, waiting for the next door to open. The fallout was quiet, which is how real consequences usually arrive. Not with headlines, but with notifications, certified letters, and structured updates logged into systems that do not sleep. And within 48 hours of the court's dismissal, I received 3 confirmations. The probate docket marked closed without prejudice, the federal continuity trust status listed as active under executor stewardship, and the credit union accounts unlocked with layered authentication requiring my biometric confirmation each time I accessed them. And I did not rush to review balances because numbers without context are noise. Instead, I scheduled an appointment with the Federal Oversight Liaison assigned in the Undersecretary's message, a retired brigadier general now operating as a civilian compliance officer. And we met in a conference room at the Pentagon Annex where the walls were neutral and the table polished to a clean sheen. And he began by sliding across a slim folder stamped Continuity Steward Brief. And he said, "Your father structured redundancy into everything." And I opened the folder to find flowcharts detailing how funds move between protected accounts if geopolitical instability interrupted standard appropriations, arrows connecting nodes in disciplined lines, each contingency mapped with precision. And he explained that the trust was not a slush fund, but a safeguard, designed to ensure liaison officers in volatile regions could be extracted or supported if official channels stalled. And I listened without interruption, steady posture, hands folded, because understanding precedes action. And when he finished, I asked, "What is expected of me now?" And he replied, "Maintain the record, authorize transfers only under documented triggers, and preserve confidentiality." And there was no dramatic oath, no ceremonial handshake. Just a structured transfer of responsibility logged into a digital registry that required my electronic signature and a secondary code sent to a hardware token he handed me. A small device that blinked once before displaying a 6-digit number, and I entered it carefully, watching the confirmation screen shift to access granted. And that was the moment the system recognized me not as a son, but as a steward. And after the meeting, I drove back to my father's house and began the practical work of stabilization, meeting with a certified public accountant to separate personal estate assets from continuity trust layers, ensuring that taxes were filed cleanly and that no overlap could invite scrutiny. And I cataloged every physical item in the house, from the metal case to the torque wrench set in the garage. photographing and labeling them in a spreadsheet because inventory is a form of respect. And when I reached the cedar box, I lifted the metals one by one, polishing each with a soft cloth until the metal reflected light in steady glints. And I placed them back in precise alignment, not as inventory, but as record. And in the evenings, I returned to a routine that felt almost military in its discipline. Waking at 0500, running 3 miles through quiet streets, brewing coffee measured to the gram the way my father did. Not out of imitation, but out of structure. And I noticed that the money in the unlocked accounts did not alter my schedule, did not tempt me to abandon the rhythm that had carried me through deployments and courtrooms alike, because validation through documentation carries a different weight than sudden wealth. And one afternoon Reza called, his tone subdued, asking to meet not about assets, but about closure. And we sat at the same kitchen table where the scratch from the Purple Heart still marked the wood. And he said, "I underestimated the scope." And I replied, "You underestimated the record." And he nodded, accepting the correction without argument. And he handed me a small envelope containing copies of every filing he had made, annotated with his own notes, acknowledging procedural missteps, and I reviewed them line by line, confirming that no residual motion lingered in any docket. And when I finished, I said, "This stays clean if we let it." And he agreed. And that was the end of the legal conflict, not with reconciliation, but with clarity. And as weeks passed, the oversight liaison sent periodic updates requiring my digital acknowledgement, small confirmations that funds had not moved and that global triggers remained dormant. And each time I logged in, inserted the hardware token, and entered the 6-digit code without hesitation, watching the system respond with access confirmed, and the repetition became almost meditative. A reminder that stewardship is not dramatic. It is consistent, and sometimes late at night I would sit in the quiet living room and open the Pelican case again, reviewing the affidavits, the travel logs, the metadata summaries, tracing my father's signature with my eyes, as if trying to decode the discipline embedded in each stroke. And I realized that the unresolved layer was not about hidden missions or geopolitical secrets, but about the way he had chosen structure over explanation, protection over confession. And I understood that his silence had been a form of responsibility, not distance. And as I closed the case and secured the latches, I felt a steadiness that did not come from court victories or federal acknowledgments, but from alignment with the system he trusted. And now I ask you, when responsibility and greed stand in the same room, which one would you document your name beside? Because discipline does not announce itself, it simply enters the record and waits to be tested.